Last night I had the strangest dream. I was laying in bed with my wife in the dream. We're both awake. We're looking at the ceiling. And up there we got a ceiling fan. And we're both looking at it, talking about the day ahead of us in the dream. Now I'm asleep in this bed in real life, so it's like Inception here. But in the dream, we're awake. We're looking at the fan. And the fan starts to evolve. It starts to transform as we're looking at it. And we're like, what? I mean, we should run away, but let's see what it turns into. I got to know. And if you can guess right now, by the way, out loud to someone else in the vehicle with you or the person next to you running on the treadmill at the gym, just shout what your guess is right now as to what that fan turned into. Go ahead. No, you really need to do this. If you don't have anybody with you, just roll down the window and shriek. Anything's fine. Okay, great. It started to turn into the business end of a meat grinder. And by business end, I mean the output end of a meat grinder. But it wasn't just the output end. I could tell by looking real close at it that it was a space meat grinder that was being forced through some kind of interdimensional portal from very, very far away. And it's like I could see deep space or another dimension around the edges of the meat grinder. And there was somebody up there, like I could hear them messing around and stuff, but I couldn't see them. And they were taking some kind of space meat and jamming it into the other end, their end of the space meat grinder, and then cranking the space handle to make the space meat come out. And it came out as space hot dogs. And they just start dropping onto our bed. And I'm like, that is crazy. And we're like, I don't know what's in that. It's not probably FDA approved, so let's kick them off the bed. And then I woke up and there were no hot dogs there, obviously. And I was like, Camilla, I have to tell you about this dream I just had. And what do you think we did? Well, you know what we did. We tried to figure out what's going on inside my brain. Why did I have that dream? And we came up with lots and lots of funny guesses. And you're welcome to come up with your own funny guesses. But this is a thing, right? I mean, when you have a dream or when you see something in literature, in fiction, and there is a transformation motif invoked, what you're getting there is a metaphor about what was and about what is and about what that means for the person who got to observe it. And as absolutely borderline offensively absurd as my example is, it still demonstrates that we know what to do with the transformation motif. Now, scrubbing our brains entirely of that so that I'm not any more blasphemous than usual, likewise, in Matthew chapter 17, we get the transformation motif in a way that we have not yet seen in the Gospels. We go from a Jesus that looks like one thing, a person, just like somebody you hang around with, who looks like a man of a certain age, who roughs it across some tough terrain with a tough crowd of buddies that he travels with, roughly like he's in his early 30s, and he looks ethnically like he's from around these parts, and he's been going around doing stuff like a normal person. He just looks like a person. And then in an instant, he looks like, well, the text can't even really figure out how to describe it because Matthew wasn't there as an eyewitness. Only James and John and Peter were. So going off of their description, Matthew describes whatever this transformation motif was as physically being like this. It says in Matthew 17:1, after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up to a high mountain by themselves. There he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as the light. And just then there appeared before them Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. So the transformation is as confusing and difficult to articulate is my ridiculous dream. What does it look like for a dude's face to suddenly shine like the sun and his clothes become white as light? My brain goes to Gandalf coming back from the dead. And what was that? That was the Two Towers, right? And he's all white and shiny now, and nobody really knows what to do with them, and they're all in awe, and they have their hands up. It's almost like Resurrection Jesus a little bit. I think that's intentional in the movies and in the books, by the way. And what they're really seeing here, what Matthew is really trying to communicate, is they are seeing Christ in his glory, or at least in a larger degree of his glory. And this is not a new concept in the Bible. In fact, it's interesting that one of the two guys who's on hand here is Moses, because there's this oft forgotten little tidbit from later in the life of Moses where he, again, hey, how about this, goes up to see God on a mountaintop. And just the reflection of God's glory and even kind of being around it is enough that now people can't look at Moses' face anymore, because if they do, the glory of God has been in some way taken on or observed by that face, and it's too much for them. And so he has to wear this veil for a while to make this thing go. So I don't think it's a coincidence that Moses is one of the guys who shows up here, because his presence in the conversation helps to illustrate and demonstrate the continuity of the glory of God. This kind of stuff has happened before. This kind of stuff has happened with Moses. You know who would know what it looks like if God's glory happens around you? Moses. And now he's here. So in a way, it's like Moses is vouching that, yeah, that's pretty much what it looks like. That's kind of the sort of stuff that I saw before. And so this is consistent with that. And this is very much developing the theme that the Old Testament gives us as dun, 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 dun. And then time goes by just begging for the completion of all that it sets up. And in the New Testament, Jesus is the bump, bump. Jesus is the completion of the Old Testament stuff. And here's just one more way that he's a completion of that. Well, likewise, Elijah. You remember the way that guy died, or sort of didn't? It was with the glorious appearing of the stuff of heaven and of God. And so on more than one occasion, these two Old Testament characters are in very close proximity of God unbridled. And if it's true that there is an ultimate, flawless, unlimited in every way being, then we're not talking about Captain Marvel power, where you got exposed to an infinity stone and now you radiate nebulous power that does something depending on what the plot calls for, and it fluctuates in intensity depending on which act we're in and how much we need you to actually do right now. And it's just ambiguously powerful, whatever. You put a glow on something in a video game or a TV show and it was like, it's magic. This is more than that. This is a logical glory. This is a glory that goes beyond superpowers or magic or science. This is a glory that is true essence, being in its purest form, unlimitedness. What would that even look like? Well, the closest thing they could come up with was fusion or fission, or the sun. It's just glowing, glorious power in the most magnificent way that the first century mind could think of to articulate it. But clearly, the words are not holding the glory for Matthew in the same way that the words did not properly contain the notion of glory for Moses and Elijah and for the people who wrote about them. I think another important connection, though, in having Moses and Elijah be the two who are here is that in addition to them having experienced the glory of God, they also had their most profound experiences with the glory of God on top of a mountain, which is where we are now. So this fits with the whole thing. And we see what we're doing there. A third reason, though, that I think it's a big deal that Moses and Elijah are the two who show up is that back here in Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, maybe the most important verse in the whole thing, Jesus says, "Don't think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets." See what I did there? "I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." So people are like, you making a new religion? What about the good stuff we already have? And Jesus is like, no, I'm the completion of the good stuff that you already have. Well, now 12 chapters later, Moses and Elijah, that's the greatest ever leader of the people, giver of the law, and the greatest ever prophet, both show up and vouch. In the same way in chapter 3, God the Father and the Holy Spirit both show up and vouch for Jesus. Now, the law and the prophets, which Jesus is here to fulfill, the number one representatives of those concepts in the mind of the original audience, they're here and they're vouching and they're like, yeah, Jesus is a man. That's the guy. Everybody vouches for Jesus throughout this whole document. It never stops. So there you go. 3 of the 12 disciples get to witness a thing that looks a lot like what the most significant leaders of the Old Testament witnessed. So I suppose it's not just that Moses and Elijah are there to vouch for Jesus, but in a way, this is also Jesus and God vouching for what these 3 guys are going to do. Like Moses and Elijah, these were people who did big things for the redemptive work of God. And now, like, seriously, James and John and Peter, like, those guys get to have an encounter that is like that of Moses the Great or Elijah the Great. Whoa, that's an additional very significant endorsement that is happening as a part of this thing. And in keeping with every other time we've seen a vouch like this from Jesus toward the disciples or toward Peter, we're going to follow up that amazing moment with the complete clumsy, ham-fisted, screw-it-up moment, again, from Peter. He doesn't know what to do with what he just saw in the same way that I don't know what to do with what I just saw, and he's going to go and blunder around with it a little bit in the coming verses, but that'll give us fodder to unpack more what this means for us and what we do with it. What I do know is this. Jesus wanted to show these guys what he looks like on his home turf. As very experienced interpreters of life and conversations and art and storytelling and even dreams, you and I intuitively know that when we witness some kind of transformative motif, there is meaning in what the thing was and what the thing transforms into. And that is absolutely still the case in this passage here, where we see a man suddenly look like God. And to see this in the context of the stuff that Jesus is saying doesn't really give us a lot of room to debate what the transformation meant. Like Camilla and I debated the hot dog space meat grinder. Who knows what that means? There's a billion different answers. There's not really a billion different answers. Like, you get it, right? It means that he is indeed Jesus the Christ, the Messiah, like Peter just said, and he really does have the glory of God because he is God. He is the eternal God. He's unmade. He's uncreated. He is God in the flesh. And if that isn't crystal clear just yet, well, we'll just keep working through Matthew, and it will not be difficult to read the cues and thematic details that we get as we move forward back into this transformation event to be able to figure out what it means and what I think it really obviously points to. Thanks for listening to my dream. Sorry for however that might affect your dreams tonight. Best of luck with that. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.